Welcome to Metrics That Matter. We will learn how to make sense of your fundraising data to make better decisions and raise more money with less effort. Brought to you by fundraisingreportcard.com, a simple and free analytics and reporting tool for nonprofit pros. Now measuring is easier than ever with fundraisingreportcard.com.
Welcome to Metrics That Matter. I'm Tim Chatton, host of the show. On the second episode of Metrics That Matter, we'll be diving into the second chapter of the ebook found for free at fundraisingreportcard.com/book. This chapter lays a really good foundation for fundraising metrics and is important to understand as we dive deeper into these fundamentals that we'll be talking about in future episodes. I'd encourage you to download your copy to follow along and maybe find some tidbits we didn't have time to cover on this episode. Go to fundraisingreportcard.com/book to download your copy. With that, let's get to the second episode of Metrics That Matter.
Hey Zach, how's it going?
It's Friday, so I'm doing well. How are you doing, Tim?
Doing good. I realized as I was editing the first episode that we don't really share with people who you are.
Wasn't that on purpose?
We just assumed we know who Zach is. I mean, you're Zach. Who are you?
I'm not sure what direction we're taking this, but let's definitely share a little bit about who people are listening to. I think at least a little, right?
Yeah. So I'm Tim. I'm on other podcasts. I do marketing and edit podcasts and stuff like that. And then you kind of spearheaded Fundraising Report Card as one of your projects. And you're kind of involved in a lot of stuff these days as well.
Yeah. So here at MarketSmart, I guess I'm kind of a little bit of a generalist, helping out across the board. Like Tim mentioned, spearheaded Fundraising Report Card, I guess it was 2 years ago. And that's obviously our analytics and reporting tool. You start building something, you realize really quickly you need to get other people who are experts involved. And you learn an awful lot by collaborating with those folks and incorporating all of their knowledge into what you're trying to build and construct. Fast forward 2 years, write a bunch of blog posts, write a book, as much as you can, present and continue learning. And you end up having a pretty substantial wealth of knowledge. Nothing too terribly complex, but I feel like I've got a pretty good understanding of our sector and some of the nuance and things like that and how data can play a role.
Yeah, and you write really in-depth, well-researched blog posts, so I'd imagine you'd learn quite a bit in that process doing that every week.
Yeah, big time, because you have to find the people who have already done this and learn from them and then kind of reiterate the points that might be a little bit too complex and simplify them. That's the style of writing I like to approach, yeah. So today's episode, we're going to be diving into chapter 2 of the book that you just mentioned a minute ago. This chapter is all about fundraising metrics 101. So the first thing that this chapter kind of dives into is why measure metrics, which we touched a little bit on in the first episode, but can we go into more about why this is important? Why do metrics matter and why should we be measuring these things? Yeah. So there's like any number of analogies you could take here. You could talk about, baking and a recipe. You could talk about your for-profit peers and how they measure metrics and things like that. And then there's myriad quotes about how you don't know where you are going until you know where you are now or things along those lines. And genuinely, it is kind of like a combination of all those pieces. So metrics are incredibly important. Having the right metrics is even more important. There's a whole concept called vanity metrics that I think I go into in the book. I've written blog posts about it in the past. You can have metrics and you can measure them on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis. And if they're not the right metrics, it doesn't matter where you stand on them.
And these are metrics that would just make you look good to your board, even though they're not delivering results. You're not able to take action based off that stuff.
Whether it be action or whether it be usefulness. So let's give an example, Tim, from our lives, right? You oversee marketing here at MarketSmart, as well as the podcast. Marketing's job is to help with the bottom line ultimately, right? So if we put like a bonus for you, Tim, based around if you get us 50 more blog subscribers and you're just focusing all your energy and attention on getting 50 more blog subscribers, but you're not doing a really good job nurturing some of those other leads that are maybe closer to working with us or partnering with us here at MarketSmart, well, then is the total count of blog subscribers really a good metric for us to be measuring against? Was it a good thing to incentivize against? The answer to those questions is no.
Right.
So if you're at a nonprofit organization, if you're in development, if you're in fundraising, you need to be wary of vanity metrics. For example, one that I come across all the time is donor acquisition.
Yeah.
The idea that, well, if we just acquire so many more donors, we can offset, any other problem we're potentially facing at the organization. You'll come across people in our space where they're fixated on total count of new donors acquired each year, every year. And especially if they're working with a direct mail house, that direct mail house is going to report to them each and every year. Look how many new donors we acquired. Look how many new donors we acquired. And that can be a vanity metric. So you can measure and know where we are at this moment in time, and we could have a goal of maybe acquiring more and more new donors. But another metric to look at might be attrition rate or donor retention rate. And if those are incredibly low, does it really matter how many new donors you acquire if you're maybe only retaining 5% of them? So the true metric to measure there would be first-time donor retention rate. How well are we retaining and building relationships with those newly acquired donors? When it comes to measuring metrics, it's incredibly important because if you're baking a cake, you want to have the right, balance of ingredients. If you're looking at your for-profit peers, you want to, kind of model in their footsteps of using data to drive decision-making. Blah, 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 all these analogies, right? But truly, it doesn't matter what metrics you're looking at if they're not the right ones. So identify which ones are correct, which ones suit the needs of your organization. The ones that we're about to walk through are very general, but in my experience over the past few years, partnering with hundreds, if not thousands of organizations by now, these 6, 7, 8, metrics that we're going to walk through, they're good fundamentals. They're good ones to have in your back pocket so that you can measure them on a quarterly cadence, so that you can report them to the board semi-annually. They're good ones to have.
Yeah, and at the end of the episode, we'll dig into some of the questions you'll want to be answering based off these metrics. So the first metric that we think is pretty important to be measuring is donor lifetime value. And how is this done? What's the calculation or the?
So to calculate donor lifetime value, it sounds pretty easy. It's unfortunately kind of complex. And it's important to note when we talk about lifetime value in general, whether it be donor lifetime value in our sector or customer or client lifetime value in the for-profit space, there are dozens of formulas to calculate this metric. It's actually kind of hilarious because, and slight tangent here, big publicly traded for-profit companies, SaaS companies, one of the big metrics that they report to their shareholders is client lifetime value. And there's actually a website. I forget the link. I wish I had it on top of mind. But there's a website that actually lists out of all the different publicly traded companies, all the different formulas they use to calculate their lifetime value because they all choose the one that makes them look the best to their shareholders.
Sure.
We're not publicly traded companies. Fortunately, we don't have shareholders to report to. We have the board and we have our donors and things like that. But that's just the kind of asterisk next to lifetime value. That's why it's candidly, really important to use something standardized tool, fundraising report card, or some formula that you've got, in an Excel spreadsheet, because you want it to be calculated the same over time. Then you can start to measure variance and things like that, which becomes important. Okay, that's a lot of pretext.
And the more honest you are with your metrics, the better it is. I mean, these are supposed to be tools to help you, not to just have a number.
Absolutely. So, lifetime value. How do we calculate lifetime value? In Fundraising Report Card, we calculate it by finding 3 input metrics, okay? So lifetime value is broken down on a per giving level segment. I think we talked about this in episode 1, Tim. You never calculate the lifetime value of an individual donor. How? John and Jane Doe gave $100 over the lifetime of their giving. I guess that's their lifetime value. When we talk about lifetime value as a projection, as a metric that projects the relationship, the value of your relationship with a potential donor, it's broken down either across the entire database or by segment. That segment could be giving level, it could be acquisition channel, things like that. But let's use the example of an under $100 donor. We want to know what's the lifetime value of an under $100 donor. So the equation for that takes 3 input metrics. The first would be average donation amount. We need to know what is the average donation amount of an under $100 donor, this year. The second input metric we need is donation frequency. How often are under $100 donors making those average donation amounts during we calculate on a 12-month period, whether
Yeah.
that be calendar or fiscal year. And then the third input metric we need lifespan. How long is an under $100 donor maintaining a relationship with the organization? Is it 1 year? Is it half a year? Is it 3.2 years? You need to calculate, or over the lifetime of your donation data. So how much data you have in your database, you can start to figure out what is the average lifespan of a particular segment of donor.
Okay, so you're not digging up health records, seeing how long they've lived or anything like that.
No, not that type of lifespan. Essentially, the lifespan of them in the database.
Okay.
So you take those three input metrics,
Mhm.
you multiply them together, and you have your lifetime value.
Yeah.
Again, you could Google search this and find 13, a baker's dozen other calculations, but that's what we use in Fundraising Report Card. And again, what's important is to measure variance in that metric over time. Is it going up? Great. Who cares how you calculate it as long as it's going up?
Right.
I don't mean
Sure.
that genuinely, but it's like if you measure your weight on the scale. If the scale's, off by 10 pounds, but each and every week it's still going down 1 pound at a time.
It's consistent with itself.
Exactly.
Yep.
That's what we're going for here.
Cool. And we'll be diving more into that in episode 4, as it does in the book as well.
Yes. Good tease.
The next metric we'll be diving into, donor acquisition costs. This is how much are you spending to get each and every donor, or the average of that, I guess. Keep diving a little bit as to why this is important and how to measure this.
So donor acquisition cost, we as well, if I'm not mistaken, go in depth in maybe chapter 3.
Yeah, chapter 3. You were right. You have good memory there.
Good. You tune in. You have to, can't miss that. But donor acquisition cost, to give a brief overview, is kind of like Tim alluded to. It's how much does it cost to acquire a new donor? And just like when we're talking about lifetime value, you're not looking in your database at John and Jane Doe. What was the expense to get them to come give to us at the gala or something like that? You could figure that out, I guess, if you really wanted to, but we look at DAC, donor acquisition cost, on generally a per campaign or per appeal basis. So you're going to look at donor acquisition costs and you're going to say, okay, from the annual gala, we acquired 150 new donors and we spent X amount on the annual gala. How much did we spend to acquire each and every individual donor? And then you start to pair donor acquisition costs with donor lifetime value to figure out, was it a profitable endeavor? We'll go much more in depth. We've got a spreadsheet that helps you calculate this. More in depth on DAC coming soon.
And that seems to be much more sensible than just general DAC, because did the website contribute to getting a donor? I'm sure it did. Did that tweet, that social media person you hired do? Like, it could get messy, but the campaign approach seems sensible.
Tim, you're in marketing. It's incredibly hard to source by channel where a client came from. That problem is huge. Google or Facebook or Amazon will probably fix it in like 5 years,
Sure.
and then we'll all be happy. But
You can even ask the donor, how'd you hear about us? They might not even remember half the time.
so donor acquisition cost is challenging. There's also other caveats, like do you include staff expense, like salaried employees, into calculating donor acquisition cost? Do you include fixed costs like your monthly rent for the office? Like, it gets really in depth. And I've found in my experience that generally it's larger institutions and organizations that have full-time staff working on data that are able to calculate donor acquisition costs consistently and effectively. If you're at a smaller shop, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, this sounds amazing, but again, I've got no time. There's 3 of us. Focusing on just lifetime value going up will probably be more important. This concept of profitability is great. And as we go into it next chapter, next podcast episode, it's going to sound awesome, but it's a ton of work.
Yeah. But the event makes sense. So if you have an event, you spent that much to put on the event, that's how many donors you got. That's pretty straightforward for that one.
I just want to take a minute to remind you to download the Metrics That Matter book by visiting www.fundraisingreportcard.com/book. This book will help you learn what data-driven fundraising is and identify key metrics to measure. You'll learn how to calculate your retention rates and identify ways you can benchmark performance against your peers, and much more. Once again, go to fundraisingreportcard.com/book to download your copy.
So the next stat, donor retention rate. This is the rate that they retain. So, yeah. Anything else on that one?
Next metric. No. Tim, I thought this was my podcast, not yours. No. If you're listening to this, you've heard of donor retention rate. It's hard to be in our sector and not hear people kind of preaching about the importance of retention rate. As Tim mentioned, the rate at which donors from last year renewed in this year. There's some nuance here. Is that over a 12-month period, an 18-month period, a 2-year, 24-month period? There's nuance in how you can calculate that, but essentially you take all the donors from the end of the last period and you look at all the donors that contributed during this period, and you divide the two, and you end up with your retention rate. It's just kind of one of those metrics that you should hear a lot in our sector.
And do some nonprofits also have a different metric for the people that are monthly givers on an automatic basis, seeing that rate of those people are retaining? Because that's a monthly thing that you can be looking at.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to want to kind of segment retention rates. So looking at retention rates of monthly donors, which year over year is probably going to be quite high because they're on that recurring payment plan versus one-time givers and things like that. There's also even renewal rate versus retention rate versus repeat donor rate. Like there's definitely nuance there. Yeah. But the way that we've approached it, and I've approached it from learning from my peers and built into fundraising report card, is year over year, they gave last year, did they give again this year? Retention. Yeah. And then calculating that rate.
Okay.
Yep.
And then kind of going along with that is upgraded and downgraded donors. So of the people you retained, are they spending more or spending less? That's the whole concept with that one, right?
Absolutely. So it's looking at cumulative giving year over year. So if we've got someone who gave, $100 last year and then they renewed this year, but in cumulative, giving, they gave $50, that's a retained donor win, but it's a downgraded donor, and they downgraded by half. They decreased their giving in half. Why? That's immediately the question that comes to mind. So when you're looking at the number of donors who downgraded and conversely the number of donors who upgraded, you're always going to want to ask why, and also then are these potential donors for gift officer portfolios, donors who have been upgrading year over year over year and increasing giving level, making sure that they're on someone's radar. That's a good use of RFM, recency, frequency, monetary, to identify a prospect. And then on the other end, with downgraded donors, they're being retained, win for the organization. It's going to make the retention rate look good. But why? Why are they decreasing their giving? Can we identify what's going on there and take some steps to learn from it and kind of counteract it?
Yeah. Okay. And then the next one, lapsed donors.
Yeah. So we talked early on about vanity metrics, right? And we focused in on acquisition.
Yeah.
And acquisition is great because acquisition kind of offsets or can offset lapsed donors. Another way to offset lapsed donors is to not have lapsed donors, but that's retention. And that's what we all strive for, is high donor retention, a high measure of how well we're building relationships. But lapsed donors are your donors from the last year, the last 12-month period, calendar or fiscal year, that gave but didn't give in any capacity in this year, in this 12-month period. Yeah. And then again, this does come back to what we were talking about with retention rates over a 12-month or 18-month or 24-month period. A lot of organizations I've had the privilege of partnering with, they will also define lapsed or attrition as not necessarily year over year, but 18-month lapse or 18-month attrition, or 24-month lapse or 24-month attrition. But essentially what you're looking for there is a consistent measure of how many donors from last year didn't renew this year, or how many donors from the last 18 months didn't renew in the next 18 months, however you decide that you as an organization want to measure that.
Will some organizations have their volunteering data and cross-check that with lapse to see good, targets to approach about their giving? Is that something that's being done, do you think?
I hope.
Yeah.
From my perspective, working primarily with organizations with their development database, I've seen so many organizations that have different databases for fundraising data versus program data, or event data, things like that, and volunteer information. But no, what you're mentioning is actually the perfect use case for a lapsed donor report. Is you should be able to visualize and see, have more donors been lapsing or less donors been lapsing, but then identify who are the donors who have lapsed, and then cross-reference that either with what I generally recommend is with giving level. Who are the highest dollar lapsed donors? Let's engage with them first. But what you're bringing to light is, who are our lapsed donors who also this year and volunteered with us or
Yeah.
engaged with the program, because obviously there's still a connection with the organization, but didn't give. So you're bringing up a good point, and that's the idea of lapsed as a kind of performance metric. It's not necessarily fun to look at, for us, Tim, would we want to really dive into our lost clients?
Not that fun, no.
Not fun, but
No.
incredibly insightful. Asking
Yeah.
them why, seeing, what we could have done differently or better, especially
And often it's easier to get business from someone you've already done business with. Same thing with donors, right?
generally.
Generally, yeah.
I mean, I've had some personal experiences where I was a donor and then I lapsed, and I know I'm sure as hell not going back to that organization. I lapsed on purpose. But if they wanted to learn why, I'd be more than happy to tell them.
Yeah.
Then the organization or our organization, we're in a position where we've grown from that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at an attrition or a lapse dashboard, on an annual basis, and then obviously looking at it even more frequently, so on a month-over-month basis, which donors from June of last year didn't renew in June of this year. That can start to key you in on, okay, I'm going to keep my eye on Jane Doe this year and see if I can follow up. Yep.
And then this goes right along with that, reactivated donors.
Yeah, so reactivated donors are donors who had previously lapsed and then came back in this year. So reactivated donors fascinate me. And actually, and I don't think we touch on it here, so I won't dive too deep into it. Reactivated donor retention rate. So the rate at which reactivated donors who come back, so they lapsed, they came back, at what rate do they then come back the next year? Mm-hmm. Man, that is fascinating to look at with organizations, because it's usually around 30%, 30 to 40%. Okay. And you've got to wonder to yourself, this donor gave, and then they lapsed, and then they reactivated, and then only about 30% of them gave again. So then 70% of them lapse again.
Huh.
It's like, why did you come back? Why couldn't we as an organization build that relationship, really connect you so that you do want to be an annual, give every year?
So those are people you should be making them as happy as possible during that
Happy
year.
as possible,
Yeah.
learning about their experience.
Mm-hmm.
You might actually start to identify that maybe they're in a pattern where they give every 18 months. Great.
Yeah.
That's fine then, because they're going to show up as lapsed and reactivate. Lapsed is reactivate.
Mm-hmm.
But reactivated donors, trying to understand their story, especially reactivated donors who then lapse again, yeah, that's a gold mine of information that can be tapped into.
The final metric, churn.
Yep.
I think this is an important one based on the book.
I think it's important too, Tim.
Yeah.
Good call.
Yeah. Why is this one
It's
so
in the
important?
book. It must be important.
It's in the book. I think when I was reading it, it's like, oh, there's special attention paid to this one over some of the other ones.
I like this because, they say, like, don't believe everything you read online. It's in the book. It's got to be important. It's online. It's got to be true.
It's the last one.
It's the last one.
Save the best for last.
Yeah, maybe.
Sure. I don't know.
But let's go with that.
Sure.
Okay, so churn is a measure of acquisition versus lapsed in any given year. So our definition of churn, the definition that we've incorporated into Fundraising Report Card, is simply that in any given year, calendar or fiscal, we're going to look at total number of acquired donors, and we're going to look at the total number of lost donors, lapsed donors. And we're going to take the difference of the two. So you're going to end up with a net gain or a net loss in terms of acquisition versus lapse. So think about a bucket full of water. I hate this analogy, but it works.
Sure.
The bucket's got holes at the bottom.
Yeah.
And there's water coming out.
Terrible
but I hate Home Depot. Just throwing that out there. So you've got the bucket, it's got water, it's got some holes at the bottom, the water's leaking out. At the top, you're filling it with more and more water. What churn is telling you is that over the course of 12 months, did more water flow out from the bottom than you were able to fill up from the top, your lapsed donors versus the acquired donors you're bringing in at the top? Or were you able to offset the water that was flowing out, your lapsed donors, with enough newly acquired donors, the water you're pouring in at the top, to actually raise the water level?
Okay.
That's what we're measuring here. And when you look at a churn report year over year over year, you start to get a sense for the velocity of change. Are we growing or are we contracting more or less quickly year over year? That's what the visual representation of a churn report.
And to continue this analogy, are your holes getting bigger? Or are you finding a way to clog them?
It's both clogging holes, which would be improving donor retention, right?
Yep.
Because that'd be less lapsed donors. Or if you really think about it, you could also just get a bigger hose, right? And fill the bucket up even faster.
Sure.
So there's multiple ways to affect churn. And then it's kind of, I know we're gonna get into this.
I mean, you could freeze the bucket too.
You could also freeze the bucket.
I don't know how you do that with donors, but yeah.
Tim Chatton, everyone, with the donor retention idea of the year, freeze them. But the idea is, you look at a churn dashboard, you look at a churn report, and you ask, okay, well, why is this happening, and what effect can we have on it? And the answers could be, let's improve donor retention rate, aka fill the holes, or screw it, let's just acquire as many new donors as we possibly can. Who cares if they lapse? That's the other mindset.
Yeah.
Not that either's right nor wrong. I'm team retention, but regardless, you can acquire a bunch more, and you can offset those that are kind of lapsing out, or you can fill those retention holes, boost retention, and that water level should hopefully rise.
Yep. Something I was just thinking about with the metrics, how often, if ever, do you need to reset your baseline if social or economic conditions just suddenly change on a dime?
Absolutely. So I've had a privilege recently of working with one of the ALS local chapters, right? So we're reviewing that data. Remember the ice bucket challenge?
Yeah.
That's going to have a huge effect on the metrics, right? Their baseline doesn't necessarily need to change, but the context for what we're looking at, we need to know what happened around us. And you're getting into kind of the most important part about fundraising data, fundraising metrics, anything, is honestly, all it's supposed to do, especially descriptive analytics, what we're talking about here, these types of performance metrics, is start a conversation. Why was there a spike? Oh, there was a spike because the ice bucket challenge went viral. Okay, great. What is our reaction to that going to be? Because now we see that, retention rates have plummeted from all the newly acquired donors. Thinking that through, having that conversation with your team, your board, and then having action items from that. We talked about this last week. The goal here, Tim, is that you have that conversation, you implement some strategy and tactics, and then you have the tools and resources to measure if those strategies and tactics had the intended effect. That's the loop that we're trying to build here.
Okay.
To your question, do we need to reset the baseline? I'm not so sure we reset the baseline. Rather, we kind of pull all that information into our context for when we're analyzing the data.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. And that would be quite the challenge, how to handle that spike.
Especially because think about how slammed they were with all those newly acquired donors. It's hard to, be so busy with all these newly acquired donors, thanking them, following up with them, to really have the effort and resources and time to think through, crap, what is our 12-month, donor retention strategy around these, these people? And it's just a function of being under-resourced, understaffed, not used to having humongous spikes in giving out of nowhere. No organization is prepared for that. So it's looking back at the data. Who are the people who lapsed? Who are the people that did retain? Why did they retain? Sparking that conversation, new strategies, new tactics, measuring the effect that they have.
The last thing I want to address is these metrics. What questions should you be, we kind of talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
What questions should you be asking that these metrics are helping you answer?
Trends.
Okay,
You're looking for trends. So these metrics, if you were to look at, for example, let's just talk about retention. If you were to look at the retention rate of just 1 year, and let's say it's 50%, cool. What can we do with that? Not too terribly much. We can say, okay, maybe next year we aim for 55% or something like that. But if you're able to look at year over year, over year, over year, a 4-year window, or maybe a 5-year window of trends in donor retention rate, and it's gone from 40% to 43% to 46% to 49% to 50%. Okay, now we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
What have we done? Why? The greatest question is why. Why has it gone from 40 to 50% over the past 10 years? Identifying trends like that in these different metrics, especially if you're able to visualize them using, a data visualization tool, a fundraising report card or something like that, seeing those trends, asking why they've gone up, they've gone down, things like that, that'll spark the best discussion, the most constructive conversation.
And answering those can be often difficult. Like, I'm not sure why that keeps going up. We must be doing a good job with something. But what is that something?
Exactly. We started our conversation today, Tim, talking about, why are metrics important? Because they give us an idea of where we are. Answering that question that you just said, I don't know why we're going up, but we are. I wonder what could be doing it. You answer that question, you start to know where we are. The more clear it is where we are, the easier it becomes to go, to take the next step to go to the next place that we want to be.
Yeah.
There's little step ups that we're trying to take here The first is, let's get a baseline of where these metrics are, what they are. Let's identify why they're moving in particular directions. That's kind of getting some of the fog out of our eyes. We're starting to see where we are. Answering these questions and going through this process can help you decide that maybe, a $2.5 million capital campaign really isn't that, feasible this year. We've got some baby steps to take before we get there. Or maybe it'll highlight to you, 2.5, that should be pretty easy. Maybe we should actually go for 4.5 or something like that. So we're just trying to build situational awareness, but instead of that being based off of someone's gut feel or their anecdotal, experiences, we're going to build that clarity through these metrics.
Now, this data and sharing this with your peers in a way that makes them excited and, wanting to get involved, what's the best way to do that? How do you make data fun or, something that they care about?
You attach that data to like a beer, or if you're a wine drinker, to a glass of wine.
Sure.
Now data's fun. No, data inherently, especially in our sector, because we're fundraisers, we're people talker tours, we're researchers, we're not necessarily data people. What I've found most effective sharing data with peers and with leadership is data visualization. You share with anyone a table of, 5 years worth of retention rates, they're going to say, okay, great. Thanks. I see the numbers. Got it. You show someone a chart that's going up and to the right and it says, plus 10% equals, 500 donors saved or something like that. Cool. You have my attention. Let's have a conversation. So I've seen data visualization play a big role in kind of furthering a conversation internally at an organization, and then especially with leadership, board members, and things like that, to get them engaged even in the slightest. Give them charts. Give them charts that go up and to the right and some context as to like what they're looking at, and you'll be taking a step in the right direction.
Okay. Like you could timeline it with different events that happen that encourage that growth almost, if you wanted to.
We've got on our KPI dashboard, our key performance indicator dashboard in fundraising report card, we have the simplest of simplest data visualizations. It's year over year donation growth. And if you do exactly what you just said, you print out this beautiful chart, it shows it going up and to the right by 18%, and you say, in March we did this, in June we did this, and ultimately for the year we were up 18%. You're going to have a happy board member. They're going to say, great. Thank you for sharing this with me. That's one you don't necessarily have to have too much discussion on, especially sharing with the board member. But to get them excited, to get them interested, go up and to the right. Why is it going up and to the right? Done deal.
Now, if your organization is having problems, how worried are some people of losing their job with sharing the data that they're gathering? Is that a concern ever? Or?
So definitely if you've got a series of reports for donation growth and donor growth and retention rate, and they're all going down and to the right, maybe now's not the right time to share that with the board or leadership, but now is the right time to talk about that internally with your peers, your equals, because the amazing thing is, talk about this loop, you have an amazing opportunity to learn why they're going down and to the right, implement some changes rather quickly, run new reports in a tool like Fundraising Report Card, or recalculate these metrics in 3 months or 6 months, show how you've had a turnaround, and then report those to the board. Data can be scary.
It can,
But also, remember our conversation from last week, from episode 1, data cleanliness, data hygiene. If all your metrics look kind of poor, make sure that you've got the right data being analyzed.
So with that, any homework for next week? Any key takeaways from this episode outside of what we just talked about?
Find that website that I was talking about for customer lifetime values. And if you don't, I'll tweet it. I'll tweet it out at...
Is it Z Chef?
No,
what is it?
Come on.
I forget it.
It's at The Data Magician. No, it's not. That would
be.
be...
You can change your Twitter handle whenever you want.
Do you think anyone's even going to listen to this part at this point? Or you think they've just...
we have high listener retention.
Are you measuring your listener retention? Okay, at Shefska, SHEFSKA. I'll find it, I'll tweet it, and enjoy it. It's hilarious.
Sweet. And with that, we'll be back next time for episode 3 and chapter 3.
We're already on to episode 3.
Next week, next time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Time flies.
Time flies.
When you're having fun.
It's true.
With Tim Chatton.
And Zach Johnson. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Metrics That Matter. If you like the show, make sure to review it on Apple Podcasts and pass it along to a colleague. If you want to take the first step we talked about in this episode, head on over to fundraisingreportcard.com to start analyzing your data and generating reports for free. Once again, that's fundraisingreportcard.com. Thanks for listening to Metrics That Matter.